No, it wasn't lively for me either, though. So let's be honest. I did like the suggestion that I should put heels on to speed up. I suspect that I will never actually try that, but all right. So we're going to talk about conflicts of interest this morning. Great. So one of the things that we get at the State Board of Accounts really quite frequently, and not just from local officials, but also from our field examiners, is sort of, hey, I've identified something that's a conflict of interest. And I think this is really interesting because those words are used in so many different contexts. I think for accountants, there is sort of one standard for what counts as a conflict of interest. When you go to law school and they force you to take this miserable ethics class before they'll give you a JD, they teach you about various conflicts of interest and what counts as a conflict of interest for a lawyer. And then in the Indiana Code, we have this lovely criminal statute that has an entirely different standard for conflicts of interest. So we get lots of allegations and comments about things people think that they have identified as conflicts of interest, and then we are forced at the State Board of Accounts to sort of analyze whether or not they fit into the statutory framework that we've been given by the General Assembly. So anytime we begin talking about conflicts of interest, the first question is, what is a conflict of interest? So the conflict of interest statute is 35-44.1-1-4. That's a criminal statute. So Title 35 is where we put all of the things that you might do that will get you put into jail, right? That's the criminal code section. So you don't want to end up in Title 35. I have never done any criminal law in the course of my career, thank goodness. I've only ever done civil cases and civil law. So it's a little bit unfamiliar to me to think about prosecutions in that light, but the statute itself is one that I'm familiar with because it fits within the broader heading of crimes against public administration. So if you're going to represent or work for a local unit of government, these are the crimes that you always worry about, right? And hopefully some of these are somewhat familiar to you or you've heard of them before. We're talking about things like conflict of interest, official misconduct, bribery, ghost employment, and profiteering from public service. This is the list of things that fit within that broader heading in Title 3544.1. But today we're just going to focus on conflict of interest. So conflict of interest is a criminal statute. It's a little bit weird in that sense because you could be prosecuted by a county prosecutor for it, but also lots of times county prosecutors are not as interested in that crime as they might be in things that are a little bit more interesting. And so sometimes the consequence of something that is a statutory conflict of interest is simply a note by the State Board of Accounts. What isn't a conflict of interest, though, right? Because we have a lot of things that come up that are problematic from local units of government, but they don't fit under the heading conflict of interest, even though they get labeled that way sometimes when they're reported. So, for example, a professional legal conflict of interest is not a conflict of interest under the statute. So when a lawyer's duty to their client is compromised by another interest, such as a duty to another client, that's a conflict of interest for the attorney. And if I, say, represent two separate clients who have different interests on each side of a contract negotiation, that's the sort of thing that the disciplinary commission might take note of and they might suspend my license for, but I'm not going to go to jail for it, most likely. That's a different standard than what we have in Title 35. An accounting conflict of interest is when an accountant's ability to act objectively is compromised by competing personal or financial interests. So you can't do an audit of an entity that you have a financial interest in, of course, because that would be a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest under Title 35 also isn't nepotism, right? That's a different thing as well. Nepotism prohibits individuals who are relatives of a person who's employed by a local unit of government being in a position where one relative is in the direct line of supervision of the other relative, and relatives are a defined term under the nepotism statute. Lots of times we get fact patterns that fit within one of these sorts of things, either a legal conflict of interest in the lawyer sense, or an accounting conflict of interest in the accounting sense, or it's nepotism, and it gets labeled as a conflict of interest, even though it really isn't. Okay, so what does the statute itself say? So 35-44.1-1-4, which is the conflict of interest statute, says that a public servant who knowingly or intentionally has a pecuniary interest in or derives a profit from a contract or purchase connected with an action by the governmental entity that they serve commits conflict of interest. So there's a lot there, including the word pecuniary, which I'm sure I will mispronounce 5 times during the course of this presentation. But what is a pecuniary interest, right? And what does it mean to derive a profit from a contract or purchase? Profit itself is undefined in the statute. So that leads to some other interesting questions. How much of a profit are we talking about needing before we're talking about profit? How definite does the profit need to be? And these questions aren't perfectly answered by the statute. Pecuniary interest, however, is defined in the statute. A pecuniary interest means an interest in a contract or purchase if the contract or purchase will result in or is intended to result in an ascertainable increase in the income or net worth of the public servant. So usually that means the person who's employed by the public agency or potentially a dependent of the public servant, if that person is under the direct or indirect administrative control of the public servant or receives a contract or purchase order that is reviewed, approved, or directly administered by the public servant, directly or indirectly administered. Dependence is very limited, right? I think when people hear the word dependent, the first thing they think about is whether or not you have to report somebody as a dependent for tax purposes. In the context of the statute, dependent really just means a spouse or potentially an individual who receives more than 50% of their support or an unemancipated minor child. So really, if we're thinking about these things seriously, we're talking about the spouse of the public servant. Those other categories really aren't going to capture a lot of people. So usually, in order to fit within 3544.114, we're not talking about somebody who is a brother or a nephew or a cousin. We're talking really about the person who's employed by the public agency or that person's spouse. Those are the people who are going to be covered by this particular statute. Now, as we'll see in a second, there is a little bit of a different standard under another statute where the term relative is a little bit broader. So there are some situations where the conflict of interest statute isn't applicable. There are a couple of times when you might actually think that you would have a conflict of interest, but the statute's not going to apply. For example, if you have compensation that's paid as salary for services. So if you have somebody who is employed in multiple positions for the same unit, that actually can be permissible under certain circumstances, provided the appropriate documentation is maintained and we don't have a dual office holding problem. As long as that's the case and you're being paid compensation as salary for services, then we don't have a conflict of interest implication, right? The statute isn't implicated in that particular circumstance. There's also a de minimis exception. So if the amount of the contract or purchase is under $250 in a rolling 12-month period, then there's no conflict of interest. If you're doing a tiny little bit of work for a public agency and getting paid $50 just once, you don't have to worry about 35-44.1-1-4. You're not going to get prosecuted for that. So there are a couple of other limited exceptions for universities and hospitals. There's also a circumstance where you can ask for an opinion from the state's ethics commission, and that provides sort of a safe harbor for you if they say that it's not going to be a conflict of interest and then a court later determines that it is. But those are really small categories. I've really never seen them implicated. The big exceptions are compensation as salary for services and then that de minimis exception. Okay, so how do you avoid being prosecuted for conflict of interest if you're really trying to do the right thing and it really makes sense for the county to sign a contract with somebody who's employed by the county? It's pretty simple. You sign a conflict of interest disclosure. Hopefully this form is intimately familiar to everybody in this room. I don't know that it's intimately familiar to everybody in local government, but county auditors are a sophisticated bunch, so hopefully it is familiar to you. There's no conflict of interest. If a public servant makes a disclosure that meets all of the statutory requirements in that very long statutory citation I have there, and this is done by filling out a form that's prepared by the State Board of Accounts. I've got a link to it right there. We've updated this form in the last couple of years, so it's a lot more, it follows the statute a lot more neatly, and it is fillable. So if you are going to fill out a form, fill out this form. Our uniform compliance guidelines actually now say that we want you to fill out our form, not just any form, for a conflict of interest disclosure. So go to that site, pull down the disclosure and fill it out if you have one or if you identify an employee who has a conflict of interest disclosure. There are some statutory requirements for what has to be in the disclosure, and the form follows these requirements. First, it has to be in writing. Well, duh. Second, it has to describe the contract or purchase. So it has to describe what is being bought by the county specifically, or what services are being procured. And then it has to describe the public servant's pecuniary interest in the contract or purchase. So how much money are you going to get, or how much is your company going to get as a result of signing this contract with the county? That's usually what that means. And then it has to be affirmed in writing under penalty of perjury. So you have to swear that you are telling the truth on the statement. That's pretty straightforward stuff. It gets a little bit more complicated when we talk about submission. So disclosures have to be submitted to the governmental entity. In your case, that's almost always going to be the commissioners, and be accepted by the governmental entity prior to final action on the contract or purchase. So if you've looked at our our conflict of interest disclosure form, you'll note there's a section for approval by the governing body that has authority over disclosures. And that's going to be the commissioners, right? So bring those disclosures to the commissioners, have them approve them before the actual contract or purchase is made, before the contract signed or the purchase is made. After you've done that and got the approval from the commissioners, then you have to file a disclosure in a couple of places. So county officials or county employees have to file those disclosures both with the clerk of the circuit court in your county. That requirement's really interesting to me. I'm not sure why it's there. I don't know if anybody has any insight on that, but that one's kind of funny. I would not think to look in the clerk's office for a conflict of interest disclosure, but then you also have to upload it to the State Board of Accounts website. And that link is exactly the same as the link I showed you before. That's the upload site. It also contains a link to where we have that fillable PDF form for disclosures themselves. Okay. I feel like it's important to mention there is this other statutory regime out there that deals with contracting with a unit, which is very, very close to conflict of interest, but it's actually a separate requirement. You'll notice this one is not a criminal statute, right? It's not in Title 35, it's in Title 36, so it's really just a compliance statute, which is much more in the SBOA's wheelhouse dealing with compliance statutes, but it's an entirely separate statute and it's a separate requirement. It applies to contracts with certain elected officials, their relatives, or a business owned by the elected official or their relative. In some ways, the 36-121 requirements are much broader than the conflict of interest requirements, and in other ways, they are far narrower. It really only applies to contracting, so we're talking about contracts for goods, services, or public works. So if we think about those as statutes, that's Title 36-112, that's the public works statute, or 522, which is the public purchasing statute. So elected official, this is good news for all of you auditors, elected officials under this statute is very narrowly defined. It does not mean everybody who's elected, which is super confusing for everyone, I think. It just means elected officials who are members of the executive body, so that's your commissioners, the legislative body, which is usually also the commissioners. For cities and towns, of course, it's different, or members of the fiscal body, which are county council members. So they're the only ones who are covered by 36-121. It does not cover auditors or assessors or recorders or any other elected offices besides those ones. So in that sense, this statute is pretty narrow, right? 35-44.1, that conflict of interest statute that is criminal in nature, that covers everybody who's employed by a county. Elected, unelected, everyone in your office, everyone's covered if you're employed by a county, a city, a town, a library, so everybody's covered. For purposes of 36-121, we're talking about a very limited subset of elected officials. The big difference that makes 36-1-21 more broad is that the term relative is really broadly defined, right? 35-44.1 covers the public servant and their spouse, pretty much. That's it. This one covers spouses, parents, step-parents, child, stepchild, siblings. You can read that long list. It's a long list of relatives who have to meet the disclosure requirements of 36-121. So if you have an elected official, if you have a commissioner, or if you have a council member who owns a business and the county is contracting with them, you need to think about this statute as well as the other conflict of interest statute. It's a little bit more complicated. Okay. So to enter into a contract with an elected official or their relative, the elected official must file a full disclosure under 36-121. These requirements are very similar but not identical to the disclosure that is stated in 35-44.1-1-4. So it's close but not exactly the same. It has to be written. It has to describe the contract or purchase. It has to describe the elected official's relationship to the business. So that feels very similar to the first requirements for the other disclosure. And there has to be a written affirmation. It also has to be accepted with the legislative body in a public meeting prior to final action on the contract or purchase. Again, same sort of requirement. Here we're talking about the legislative body. And then it has to be filed with the State Board of Accounts and Clerk within 15 days of final action. Those requirements seem like they're exactly the same as the requirements for the other disclosure, and yet there is this additional requirement, right? The disclosure also requires a certified statement if there's an elected official who you're contracting with or their relative. It also requires a certified statement from the appropriate agency of the public unit that the purchase price or contract amount was the lowest, or if it wasn't the lowest, some explanation as to why that particular contract was entered into, even though it was not the lowest. So we have a slightly different form for this disclosure than for the other disclosure. It's State Form 55032. I've listed the the IARA's catalog here of forms. There's a link right there. If you search for this form number, you will find the form for this type of disclosure. So again, just like to quickly review, we have a couple of different requirements. The conflict of interest disclosure requirement is in Title 35, and it applies to anybody who is employed by the county or their spouse, right? The contracting with a unit requirements apply only to elected officials and that narrowly defined subset of elected officials, but it also applies to really any of their relatives. So keep in mind if you have somebody come to you and say, look, 35-44.1, that doesn't apply because we're doing a contract with the commissioner's nephew, so there's no conflict of interest at all. Well, there may not be a conflict of interest under 35-44.1, but there is going to be this other statute, 36-121, that's relevant, and there will have to be some disclosure made to the public about that contract that the county is going to enter into. So, and if you have confusion about these things, because it's tough to track when one applies or whether both apply or if neither applies, reach out to Stacy, reach out to me. We can help you navigate when a disclosure is required and when it isn't. I will tell you our advice in this space tends to be conservative. If we see something that looks like it might require a disclosure under 35-44.1 or 36-121, we tend to say you should fill out the disclosure. You don't want to get in trouble on the back end. This is real close, and you don't want to chance it, especially with the criminal statute, because at the end of the day, while we can give you some guidance on whether or not a disclosure is required, ultimately a county prosecutor could make a decision that's entirely independent of what Stacy or myself tell you, because they can make choices about whether to prosecute something regardless of whether or not we've given you advice. Frankly, they don't care what we have to say about something. They're going to do their own thing when it comes to making choices about what to prosecute. So, do you have any questions about these two statutes, 35-44.1 or the contracting with a relative statute, contracting with an elected official statute? Okay. Crystal clear, I see. So that's good. I do want to go through a handful of examples here. Just these are ones that we've either had bubble up in the form of questions that we've answered. Again, we won't use any names. I don't know that any of them are county ones, just to sort of see what you think about them. So A small town had a services contract with an individual to mow the town's cemeteries for $500 per year. So this pops up all the time in tiny towns, and we have lots of tiny towns around Indiana. The mower is retiring, and the town cannot find anyone to take over mowing duties at a price the town can afford. So oftentimes, small towns, small townships, they have very limited budgets, and so they are very constrained in terms of what they can spend on things like maintenance. A town council member offers to solve the problem quite generously and mow the cemeteries themselves, and they'll accept a mere $400 per year, which is way cheaper than the previous guy was doing it, right? So do we think that this presents any conflict of interest problem? And I think you may have the answers in your slides, but still, yes, I hear yeses. That's the right answer, right? It's a conflict. It doesn't matter whether or not the council members' intentions were positive, right? It doesn't matter that the town is going to be saving money compared to the previous contract. The statute does not care about those good, kind intentions that the town council member has. It doesn't care that the town was in a pickle and could not find anybody to do the job until this council member stepped up. It's a conflict either way. The answer, though, is really straightforward here, right? This should be the best and easiest conflict of interest disclosure anybody has ever filled out, right? So fill out the disclosure, submit it to the town council, have them sign off on it, and you can go forth and mow the cemeteries for $400 per year. So do the disclosure, you're in the safe harbor, and it's no problem at all, right? It would also, interestingly, be a problem in terms of contracting with a unit, right? So we'd have to have both disclosures filled out here because we have an elected official on the legislative body of a town who's covered by this. So, okay, example number 2. I guess I do have a county here. The county's long-standing highway superintendent retires. The commissioners select a replacement who happens to be the spouse of a current county council member. So members of the public, citizens, we'll call them, this is like the most frequent conflict of interest email we get. If we get an email that's titled conflict of interest, chances are they're saying something like, hey, one of the county council members or this city council member has a spouse who is working as the planning director, and that's a conflict of interest, right? And we would like you to investigate that and do a full audit, and I think that you should report it to the county prosecutor. Everybody gets fired up about those sorts of things, but really, it's really not a conflict of interest in any way, right, guys? Statutory conflicts have nothing to do with contracts or pecuniary. This statutory conflict has nothing to do with contracts or pecuniary interests, and compensation paid as salary for services doesn't qualify, right? So you might think about nepotism here. That's where my brain goes to. People smell something that they think smells like nepotism, and they say it's a conflict of interest. And that's the right way to think about it. But it's also not a problem in this fact pattern with nepotism either, because there's a nepotism exception for people who are on the council or the commission, right? The nepotism statute does not include any situation where the responsibilities of the executive or legislative body or fiscal body of a unit as provided by law, where they make decisions about budgets, salary ordinances, or personnel policies of the unit. So if you have commissioners or council members who are making those sorts of decisions, that doesn't count under nepotism as being in the direct line of supervision of somebody who's underneath the commissioners or council members. So just because somebody is a relative who's also employed by the county, that doesn't make it automatically a conflict of interest. In fact, it probably isn't a conflict of interest in most circumstances. Does everybody follow that? Hopefully that was easy. All right, example number 3. This one's a little bit more interesting. A city council member, we'll make it a county council member. A county council member takes a position as the new CEO for the local United Way. The county's parks department has several contracts with United Way. The council member points out that they won't ever have anything to do with approving or executing the contracts from the county's side. They'll only be involved in the contracts from United Way's side. They're not even going to think about negotiating the contracts on behalf of the county, dealing with them on behalf of the county. They'll even recuse themselves from any vote that might come before the county council related to United Way and any of these contracts that the county council would have to be involved in. What do we think? Do we think that's a conflict of interest? Our answer is yes. It's a conflict of interest, right? The council members' lack of relative involvement in the contracting on the county's side of the bargain is not relevant under the statute, right? So in this circumstance, they're going to be working as the chief executive officer for the local United Way. That's a pretty prominent role. They're going to get a significant salary from United Way potentially for that. And sure, they're going to be doing good things. Everybody's going to feel good about it. And yet the fact that there are contracts between the county and United Way and the county provides some support potentially, that's going to cause a problem. So this is a problem that we deal with a lot. When there's a contract between a local unit of government and another entity, and that there's a person at the county who works both for the county and also draws some salary from the other entity, at what point do we say, look, that's really a pecuniary interest, you're really deriving a profit in your role with the other entity? And that's a difficult call to make. We have to do it on a case-by-case basis, right? A CEO is really easy. If you're the CEO of a company and the county has a contract with that particular company, that's going to be a conflict every time. But if you're the janitor, if you're just an unpaid board member for the corporation, does that qualify? Probably not. So we just have to look at exactly where you fall in terms of the hierarchy on the other side of the contract before we can make a decision about whether or not there's a conflict. Again, though, our advice always tends to be conservative when we're dealing with these types of fact patterns. If it's close to a conflict, it can never hurt to fill out the disclosure. Sure, it might be annoying to go to the commissioners and try to tell them about things. They might give you a hard time. But if you want to be safe, the safe harbor is always in filling out the disclosure when there might potentially be a conflict. Okay, I don't know if anybody has any questions or has any particular situations that they've dealt with in terms of conflict of interest, but I see.
When you talk about the forms, the conflict of interest or whatever need to be brought before the legislative or executive, and they actually have to be discussed in a public meeting, they can't just be under the consent agenda and not discussed?
I think they could absolutely be under the consent agenda,
Okay.
and they could be not discussed. The language that's used in the statute is they have to be accepted, right? Which is
Okay.
just a miserable term for a lawyer, right? What does that mean?
Yeah.
We have interpreted accepted to mean that some type of vote was taken. If it's part of the consent agenda and a vote is taken on the consent agenda, that's good enough for us, right? We'll see it in the minutes, and we can see on the agenda that that particular disclosure or that particular series of disclosures was part of the consent agenda. But accepted does imply more than just hey, we emailed it to the commissioners, right? So we would expect it to be something that happens in a public meeting. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, no, we have a situation. I think we have a situation, and nothing was done before the contract was enacted, and I don't know. I'm surprised our attorney didn't advise them better, honestly, but nothing that I know about. And that's why I'm saying I wonder if it was part of a consent agenda. It just wasn't. No.
Yeah, again, on the one hand, I hate to be difficult about it. You're playing a little bit with fire, right? Because the State Board of Accounts might identify a conflict of interest. It might appear in an audit report, but the real concern is that we're talking about a criminal statute here, which is scary and uncomfortable for me. So that's why you fill out the disclosure when in doubt, so that there's no chance anything untoward comes back on you, right? That's the safe harbor. That's the best way to go. But it does have to be accepted by the appropriate governing body, and that's almost always the commissioners for a county. It has to be accepted by the appropriate governing body in a public meeting. So I think we have one more.
What is a consent agenda?
Oh yes, so yeah, we'll venture into parliamentary procedure here. So most boards and commissions, like the county council, the county commissioners, you actually don't always have to prepare an agenda. It's actually not required by the open door law, but in terms of making sure that your board and commission members and the public are aware of what's going to be discussed at a meeting, it's commonplace, really pretty much universal, to prepare an agenda or order of business for your board or commission ahead of time. One tool that's available if you have a series of non-controversial matters that, you know, no one's really going to care about and no one's going to do anything about, if you're going to have a really long meeting, you can have what's called a consent agenda. So you would put 5 or 6 items up there. The process I'm familiar with seeing in board and commission meetings is somebody would move at the beginning of the meeting to approve the consent agenda. Oftentimes before somebody would make a motion to approve the consent agenda, the president of the board or commission, if they're good at their job, would say, do any board or commission members want to take anything off of the consent agenda and put it on the regular agenda? Every now and then somebody would say, yeah, actually, I really want to talk about this contract up here that you thought was going to be not controversial. I want to move it onto the regular agenda. That one will be pulled out, and then there will be a motion to approve the consent agenda. The board or commission would vote on it. Usually it's unanimous. And then all 5 or 6 items that were on that consent agenda at the top just get approved in the aggregate altogether, right? What was our Board of Public Works when I worked at the city would do that because they would typically have 3 or 4 hour meetings, right? Given all of the things they had to approve. So in order to save that 20 minutes on those extra motions they would do on each of those items, they would use a consent agenda. I don't know, does anybody use a consent agenda around here? Obviously some folks maybe do, so I see some hands. Does that sound like the right description of what a consent agenda is? Great. Anything else? Okay. Thank you guys very much.